Okay, we're going to get started because we've got a short amount of time. I'd like to welcome you to this very, very special event. This evening we have the international final of Debating Matters. We have the reigning champions from Debating Matters India, immediately behind me, taking on the reigning champions from Debating Matters UK. Now I just want to say just a few words before I hand over to my colleague Justine about Debating Matters. For those of you who do not know about it, it's a competition for 16 to 18-year-olds. It gives them a really rigorous intellectual challenge. We require students to grapple with some of the most complex and knotty issues facing society, which society does not know the answer to itself. Now, if that wasn't difficult enough, we require them to do so in front of a panel of distinguished judges who don't sit there scribbling notes, but actually interrogate each team and cross-examine them on their arguments, asking them probing questions and challenging them to develop their arguments in front of your very eyes. So it's a big ask of each of these teams. If you think it sounds a little scary, I can say that I've seen both teams win their national championships, and they are both scarily bright. So don't feel sorry for them. They can handle it. They'll be just fine. Just very briefly, I also want to just acknowledge a few organisations. We work with approximately 300 schools in both the UK and India. In India, the competition is produced by the British Council India, and I'm delighted to have here Charlie Walker, the Director of Programmes, Dr. Guru Gujral, and Bahadur Negi. Please give us a quick wave. Who've travelled from Delhi. They travelled from Delhi to be with us, but most importantly, it's the British Council India that produced the competition and delivered the competition in India, and we're delighted to work in partnership with you on that. This is the pinnacle of 2 years of work, 2,000 students, nearly 1,000 individuals involved in judging the competition, a number of whom are in the audience tonight, and somewhere around about 800 teachers if you take the two countries together. So this is the climax of that event, and we're now going to allow you to get on with it after one last thing, which is to say, without the support of all those individuals it wouldn't be possible, but equally it wouldn't be possible without our funders and partners. And I particularly just want to mention tonight the Wellcome Trust that have supported the competition for 8 years and have supported it in both UK and India, and also to welcome and acknowledge the role of Statoil, the Norwegian international energy company, who are the headline partners for Debating Matters UK from this year. So good luck to both teams, and over to my colleague Justine Brian, National Coordinator of Debating Matters.
Tony, thank you very much. Right, the motion before the debaters is clinical trials in developing countries are exploitative. Arguing for that motion on my right, we have Graveney School from London, UK National Champions. And arguing against the motion on my left, we have Our Lady Queen of the Mission School from Kolkata, DM India Champions. I'm going to get the students to introduce themselves to you quickly now. I'm then going to introduce you to our distinguished panel of judges, and then we'll get going with the debate. So, Graveney team, Georgia Haigh and Aaron Stead. Let's hear from you. Tell us a bit about yourself. Georgia.
Hi everyone, I'm Georgia. I've been debating for the past 2 years and I've really enjoyed participating in the Debating Matters competition. This year I'm working on the gap year scheme at the Bank of England, which is a really exciting experience, and next year I hope to go to university.
Thank you, Georgia. And Aaron?
I'm Aaron. We won the national championship last year. I'm currently at the University of Portsmouth studying economics.
Is that all you want to say?
I don't know what else to say.
You're going to have to develop your biography in the future. But welcome to the Graveney team. Yes, a round of applause. Okay, and let's meet Payaswini Bahadur and Arushi Dhupia from Our Lady School. Payaswini, let's hear a few words from you.
Good evening everyone, I'm Payaswini and I'm pursuing a course in political science in college, Lady Shri Ram College in Delhi. London is a beautiful city and so is Calcutta. I would invite all of you to come over.
And Arushi.
Good evening everybody, my name is Arushi Dhupia. I'm a student at St. Xavier's College, Calcutta. I'm doing BCom Honours and Chartered Accountancy. I love debating and I love playing the piano, and I'm looking forward to a very interesting time right here.
Fantastic. Great to see we nearly have a full house as well. That's very impressive. So, debaters, you're both familiar with the format. It's identical in the UK and India. You each have 3 minutes to make your opening presentation. After 2.5 minutes, I'll tap on the table, indicating you have 30 seconds left. So, just to remind you, the motion is... Oh, the judges, well done. Sorry. So, I wondered what Aaron was nodding at. Judges, forgive me. Sorry. So, our distinguished panel of judges. Sitting furthest away from me, we have Sangeeta Bahadur, who's the Minister of Culture from the High Commission of India and also Director of the Nehru Centre. Sangeeta, prior to her posting here in London, had postings in Spain, Bulgaria, Mexico and Belgium. She's also served in the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi in various capacities, including as Deputy Director General of the Indian Council for Cultural Relations. The daughter of a senior civil servant, she was born in Kolkata and schooled in various cities around the country. She completed her college and university education from Mumbai, subsequently qualifying for the prestigious Indian Foreign Service. She's married to an architect, has 2 teenage daughters, is a gifted though eclectic singer, she says, and she's also a well-known author. So welcome to Sangeeta. In the middle there we have Professor Diana Gibb, who is the Professor of Epidemiology and Programme Leader of the Paediatric Programme at the MRC Clinical Trials Unit here in London. Over the last 20 years, Diana has set up and coordinated a network of clinical trials and cohorts across Europe, Thailand and South America, mainly addressing questions of paediatric HIV infection. Since 1999, her focus has expanded to Africa, where she runs large trials addressing strategy questions in adult and paediatric HIV infection, and more recently in malaria and tuberculosis, collaborating widely with clinical and research centres in 6 countries in East and Southern Africa. Wide interdisciplinary collaboration with health economists, pharmacologists, social and basic scientists and innovators of medicines for children are incorporated into those trial programmes. She's also served on a number of World Health Organization advisory and guideline committees and continues a clinical commitment at the HIV Family Clinic at the Great Ormond Street Hospital here in London, which she started back in 1991. So welcome to Diana. And last but by no means least, one of our long-standing judges, very experienced debating matters judge, Rob Killick, who is the co-founder and CEO of cScape digital agency. Rob says that cScape has ridden the waves of the digital revolution over nearly 20 years, and Rob has written in a wide range of publications on the digital industry and also on economic growth. He speaks frequently at conferences and in debates, and as I say, judges for us often. And has a reputation for being quite a fierce judge, which we approve of. So, huge welcome to the Right, so I hope you 4 aren't as nervous as I am. So, without further ado, just to remind you, clinical trials in developing countries are exploitative. First to argue for the motion from Graveney School is Georgia. Are you ready?
Good evening everyone, I'm Georgia and I will explain how clinical trials exploit people in developing countries. Or my partner, Aaron, will discuss why they lead to worsening international medical provision. Firstly, we need to clarify what we mean by clinical trials. Clinical trials are the testing of potential drugs on an appropriate population sample. The majority of trials in the developing world are phase 3 trials. Mass human trials to test the effects of new medicines. In the Declaration of Helsinki, the WHO established the international guidelines for clinical trials, but national governments are responsible for setting up their own regulatory bodies for trials conducted in their country. So why are clinical trials in developing countries exploitative? Firstly, pharmaceutical companies are making huge financial gains in outsourcing their clinical trials to developing countries. It costs about £2,000 to track the process of a single Indian patient in a clinical trial, but 10 times more in the US. Indeed, China has overtaken India as the largest destination for clinical outsourcing, and the LSE reckon the industry is worth £50 billion. In outsourcing trials, companies are able to avoid the necessary regulations and health and safety requirements required to ensure the best possible medicine is produced. For example, fewer than 6 in 10 trial participants, trial protocols, in developing countries get reviewed by an ethics committee. In particular, 1 in 10 Chinese trial protocols get an ethics review. Furthermore, 4 in 5 of those protocols fail to discuss informed consent adequately. Also, the Drugs Controller General of India, the DCGI, is understaffed and lacks the expertise to evaluate protocols, making it easy for pharmaceuticals to avoid the already lax regulations in place. The safeguards in developing countries are not nearly as stringent as those in developed countries. There is also the problem that many trialists in developing countries are trial naive. They don't represent those in developed countries who already have resistance to certain drugs as a result of having had access to medication throughout their lives. Equally, a cool-down period is required after participation in a trial. Given that many in developing countries are participating in numerous trials at one time, any evidence is often inaccurate, dangerous for trialists as well as potential users. People are being exploited for the sake of unreliable science. Ultimately, pharmaceutical companies are capitalising on desperation, endangering the lives of some of the most vulnerable, and this is exploitation.
Georgia, thank you very much. Okay, first to speak against the motion is Payaswini. Yeah, whatever you're comfortable with. When you're ready.
Let me begin by defining the word clinical trials according to the World Health Organization. Any research study that prospectively assigns human participants to one or more health-related interventions to evaluate the effect on health outcomes is a clinical trial. Now, trials may be either commercial or academic, but we need to understand one thing, that whatever may be their nature, clinical trials are the only way to determine the safety and efficacy of drugs. And for pharmaceutical research to be successful, trials have to be conducted whether in a developing country or in a developed country. Now, as pointed out by the team for the motion, very correctly, most of the trials happening in the developing countries are phase 3 trials, but at this juncture we need to know that before the phase 3 trials are entering the developing countries, there is a phase 1 and a phase 2 trial happening in the developed countries. The phase 1 trial being a human pharmacology trial and the phase 2 trial being a therapeutic exploratory trial, where the effectiveness of the drug on a smaller sample and the side effects of these drugs are tested before being sent to the developing nations to be tried on a larger sample. And we also need to know that before the phase 3 trials to happen in developing countries, it is very essential for the phase 1 and phase 2 trials to give us positive results. Therefore, if there is any tangible benefit or harm seen in the phase 1 or phase 2 of the trial, this trial does not even reach the developing countries, minimizing a huge amount of the risk that could have taken place had there been no regulations in place already. Now, one of the most important reasons why trials have to be sent to the developing countries is the genetic diversity prevalent in the developing societies, which helps in assessing the drug effectiveness among a larger sample of the population. It won't be right to blindly follow the results of a research that is taking place in developed countries and extrapolate them to the developing countries where there is no surety whether the ethnic difference will still make the drug as effective on people living in the US or Europe, on the people living in India and China. For example, AstraZeneca's drug of lung cancer, Iressa, proved to be very beneficial for Asians but did not prove helpful for the Western population. Therefore, genetic diversity plays a very important role in determining drug effectiveness, and therefore it is essential that trials for global medicines also take place in developing countries to assess whether they are going to be useful for people in these countries or not. I wanted a small stakeholder analysis to tell you how clinical trials taking place in developing countries are essential and beneficial rather than exploitative. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about the participating patients. They receive qualified and good quality medical health care, which is otherwise absent in developing countries because of resource scarcity. Therefore, rather than getting no treatment for any kind of illness, these clinical trials are giving them free medical supervision. Also, the indigenous physicians or doctors who take part in carrying out these clinical trials in collaboration with the Western companies get training and expertise by carrying out these trials. And this capacity building that is taking place in the developing countries will further encourage more indigenous research and reduce dependency on research that is being outsourced from outside. Therefore, clinical trials have a lot of benefits that are entailed both for the patients, for the government, and for the physicians living in these countries, thus proving to you that clinical trials are not only beneficial but essential in developing countries because there is a dire need for medication and progression in research in these countries.
Thank you. Well done, Payaswini. Motion is Erin and Maria.
Thank you, judges and opponents, and George for getting us off so well. Now, I'd just like to say something. It's often said that clinical trials in India are a lot cheaper, but what does this actually mean? See, because it doesn't really hold much relevance, because between 2004 and 2008, Pfizer, one of the largest drug companies in the world, started to shut UK research facilities and opt for cheaper research in the developing world. Yet over the same period, they had a 33% drop in new medicines approved. See, developing world trials is just big pharma creating a smokescreen behind which they can be cheap or manipulate the system so that they can get substandard drugs through to market. If you don't believe me, then why in America did the FDA make GlaxoSmithKline pay $3 billion for not revealing unflattering results from developing world trials that would hinder their prospects of getting a new drug approved? Now, let me take you through a typical Indian drug trial. Stage 1. Out of a sea of desperate volunteers who present themselves to you, pick those who will give you the best possible result. Stage 2. Remove any candidate reacting in a negative way and hide the data, like GlaxoSmithKline did. So that means we don't actually know the scientific result, just a fixed one. And we as consumers are clueless to the side effects. Yet it gets worse than this. Due to historical diets, people in the Asian subcontinent and Europe have different enzyme ratios in their livers, and so metabolize drugs differently. So how someone on a trial in Chennai reacts is completely different and bears no correlation to how Stephen Slough does. So we don't even know the relevance of the shoddy science anywhere. Now, let's say a firm notices the mediocrity of the research and decides to enter the market and do good science, not fixed science, on relevant population samples to produce drugs which will wipe the floor with their competitors in a free market. Well, they can't. You see, pharmaceuticals is an oligopoly in which all the major players subscribe to the same developing world orthodoxy. So we as consumers are exploited. We have no market power, and so we're left with worse drugs and not knowing what to do. Now, my opposition tried to make the point that developing world trials are all really nice and hunky-dory. But what me and George have clearly shown you is that if you support the opposition, in fact what you support is the exploitation of the poorest and most needy in the developing world. You support the bastardization and fixing of science, and you actually support the exploitation of yourself. Therefore, I implore you to support the motion, if not for those who are destitute in the developing world, then at least for yourself.
Erin, thank you very much. And finally, to speak against the motion, Arushi. When you're ready.
As suggested by the motion today, our focus is centered around developing countries and the inherent deficiency that all of them suffer from, which is lack of resources. For the progress of medical science in these countries, there is a need for trials to take place, and it also entails certain economic benefits. Firstly, encouraging clinical trials in the country, first foreign-sponsored and then indigenous, leads to the entry of various new drugs into the market, increasing competition among manufacturers and leading to lower price of these drugs, making them more affordable. In the current situation, good quality healthcare is important from other countries due to their absence in the third world countries. An increasing experience of the developing countries with research and clinical trials increases standard of research and healthcare at home, thus cutting down the need to depend on foreign support for medicines, thereby decreasing differential costs. Also, due to lesser labor costs in developing countries, the overall cost of conducting trials there is 60% cheaper, which gets reflected in lower prices of medicine in the market. Advent of clinical trials into indigenous hospitals brings with it cutting-edge technology, funds in the form of compensation for participation, and acts as a positive investment to improve facilities. Thus, encouraging clinical trials enables the developing countries to overcome the stumbling blocks of resource limitations by making drugs more affordable and creating better infrastructure. The developing nations and their governments have identified the requirement for progress in research in their countries, the instruments for which are clinical trials. Therefore, there exists a legal and regulatory framework to ensure that there is a balance between ethics and medical practices in the process of clinical trials. Thus, efforts have been made by the nations to create a robust and sustainable framework for this. For an example, in Africa, Pre-Trial Registration Authority enables registration and evaluation of all trials and gives the participants an avenue to access any kind of information related to the drug or the trial. It is the existence of these mechanisms that have enabled countries like Africa to make advances in clinical research. Testing for the world's most advanced malaria vaccine was recently initiated in Tanzania. Over 16,000 children will receive this vaccine in Africa, where 1 million people are killed by malaria every year, being children. The status of the country as developing is not the factor in play. Had this been the case, there would have been no success stories in the countries in the first place. The few cases of failure must not be attributed to the fact that they are developing countries. Scientific misconduct is a global phenomenon linked to human behavior and not to the status of a country. Also, individual biochemistry plays a huge role in the reaction a drug may have on one's body. Therefore, side effects or health issues during the trial cannot be blamed on the trial itself. Efforts have been taken to introduce new initiatives like having a multidisciplinary ethics committee on the regulatory body, introducing new forms of informed consent via mechanisms like the speaking book, which is already in practice in Africa. There has been no path-breaking drug discovery since penicillin in 1947. For overall medical progress to facilitate research in developing countries, responsible behavior would be to contextualize procedures so that regulations work in favor of the success of trials. The answer lies in a collective effort to make the system sustainable and not to abandon it. Thank you.
Arushi, thank you very much. Teams, you've laid out your respective side of the debate. I'm going to ask Payaswini and Arushi to sit back as far as you can, I'm afraid, so that the judges can see Georgia and Aaron. So judges, we're going to turn to you now for an initial opening question for the Graveney team arguing for this motion. We'll take all three questions in a row, give these guys the opportunity to respond, and then we'll open it up to dialogue. Rob, could we start with you, please?
Yeah, are there no benefits to the developing world from clinical trials?
Thank you, Rob. Diana, please.
Yes, I mean, if you are saying that clinical trials are exploitative and you shouldn't be doing them, then what do you suggest to do in their place?
Thank you, Diana. And Sangeeta.
My question is that, a country like India, for example, which has its own large pharmaceutical industry, we produce our own drugs and we do our own trials on our own people. So why prevent other companies from coming in and doing the same?
Judges, thank you very much. Tough but succinct points for you two to tackle. You can answer in any order you like. And over to you.
Diana, you said, what do we do instead of clinical trials? We aren't proposing that you shouldn't do clinical trials. We're just proposing that you shouldn't do them in a way which is exploitative of everyone involved.
Okay. To answer Rob's question, are there no benefits to conducting clinical trials in developing countries? Of course there are benefits of conducting clinical trials in developing countries, but that's if you're conducting the trials for drugs that are going to actually be affecting people in developing countries, so you can see how a drug might actually affect people who are going to be using it. It makes no sense to conduct a trial for a drug in a developing country that's going to be used by people in developed countries. You're not getting an accurate representation of how somebody in a developed country is going to react to it.
So you're saying the pharmaceutical companies are stupid?
I think
no, we're saying that they're taking advantage of it's just capitalism in motion. If costs are cheap and they need to jump through certain loopholes with the federal with authorities, then they're obviously going to try and do it as quickly and as cheaply as they can. What we're concerned with here is the actual ability of the medicine to be the best it can be, and generally that isn't happening due to the situation as it is now.
So who decides whether a trial is exploitative or not?
Well, I think the first thing is whether the scientific method has been followed through by to its fullest, which generally doesn't happen in India. There was a book written
by a guy called Chin and another man called Lee. One is a biotic CEO and the other is a lecturer at the University of Philadelphia, and they basically make the point that the majority of clinical trials in India are conducted in a way which doesn't follow the scientific method. And so by nature that means it's exploitative, because we as consumers end up with a worsening quality of medical provision.
So what you're saying is that the drug companies are deliberately testing their drugs in places where they're not being effectively properly tested, so they can bring them back to the developed world, take them to market, and with no confidence at all that they're safe.
Well, no, because due to
why would they do that?
No, due to phase 2 trials, they know they're relatively safe, but the whole thing isn't. Their effectiveness is lessened, and so we, as consumers, although we may not be put kind of in the line of dying, we don't get as good a medical provision as could otherwise be.
So which drugs could you name which have had that less than efficacious effect?
There was there recently, when was it? It was actually February this year, Pfizer released a drug it was a contraceptive drug actually, and it had virtually no effect, and they ended up having to do a recall because it really didn't do what anything it said it was meant to do.
So this was because it had been tested in the developing world, and there was some genetic difference or something, is that?
Well, no, it just, because they'd just gone to the developing world and to get through loopholes and things, it just meant that they were going to put it out there a lot easier.
Okay, I want to give Diana an opportunity to come in, but also Sangeeta asked a very pertinent question, which is if India produces and tests its own drugs, why shouldn't it welcome in external drug companies? Well, the thing is...
Yeah, sorry, was I just going to come in and just ask you about the FDA, if they're also stupid? Because, I mean, things have to usually go through the FDA and the EMA in order for them to be used in the north.
I don't think they're stupid, but as I mentioned in my speech, GlaxoSmithKline will find $3 billion for hiding research. And so, because there is almost this removal by going to the developing world where standards aren't as high.
And you think that happens more often than not? That that's a very common occurrence?
I think it's happening more and more at the moment.
Yeah.
I think that, research has proved that in the past sort of 10, 15 years, the number of trials that are being outsourced to developing countries is dramatically increasing. I think that, going back to a point that was made that, who decides what is an ethical trial, I think a really good document is the Declaration of Helsinki, which really clearly sets out different sort of international guidelines for clinical trials, particularly point 17, which states that medical research involving disadvantaged or vulnerable population or community is only justified if the research is responsive to the health needs and priorities of this population or community. And if there's no reasonable likelihood that this population or community stands to benefit from the benefits of these results and the research, then it's not right to be conducted in that.
And then this brings into Sangeeta's question, which is why should we prevent outsiders doing it? Now, I don't think we should prevent them, I just think that they're being exploitative. We aren't anti-clinical trial here, we're just anti-exploitation.
I think that there's a far greater chance that people in developing countries are likely to be exploited than those in developed countries, given the sort of economic circumstances and the lack of medical care that is...
If I may just add something. You also said something about how it's much cheaper to do such trials, conduct such trials in developing countries. But isn't that for the good of the whole world? I mean, the cheaper the trials, the more accessible the drugs become to
The reason they're cheaper is because, well, we all know that if I wanted to buy a suit from Marks and Spencer, it would cost about 140, maybe £200. If I wanted to buy one from Savile Row, it would cost £2,000. You get a better quality generally with a better price. And so just because it's cheaper doesn't mean you necessarily get a good quality of research. Just because something's cheap, especially with something which concerns people's lives. Should we just go for a race to the bottom, or should we strive for excellence?
Anything further, judges? Are you happy with that? Thank you very much. That was tough. Even I was scared about that. So, judges, thank you for your questions to Graveney. Let's turn now to Our Lady Queen of the Mission School, arguing against the motion. Same process, please, judges. Rob, can we start with you again?
The principle of informed consent, as I'm sure you know, was enshrined after the Second World War and the Nuremberg trials. as in response to the Nazis experimenting on people against their consent. Do you really believe that in some of the poorest and most desperate parts of the world, that people there are capable of giving informed consent to a process which involves quite a sophisticated understanding of drugs and this sort of thing? Is that really what's happening there?
Thank you, Rob. Diana, please.
Yes, you argued that doing clinical trials resulted in better informed doctors and a better health system in some way. What's your evidence for that?
Thank you, Diana. And Sangeeta.
One of you mentioned that one of the reasons why these trials are conducted in developing countries is because of the ethnic diversity that it offers. But I would like to make 2 points. One, that your opposing team pointed out how a majority of these trials have shifted to China, and I would not say China is an ethnically diverse society at all. And secondly, I would say that a country like the US or even the UK has about as much ethnic diversity as, say, India. So why do they need to seek out developing countries to do this kind of thing?
Judges, thank you. So, Payaswini and Arushi, over to you for responses.
I would like to begin with answering Roxa's question. So that's exactly what we are trying to say through our speech, that we are not in favor of a very technical and complex consent form presented to these tribal people living in villages, and they just put a signature or a thumb impression and give their consent. That's not the kind of informed consent we're looking for. That's why we propose to contextualize the whole framework of clinical trials without just sticking on to the technical aspect and increasing an interaction with the people involved in the trials through the leaders of the community. So when the multidisciplinary ethical committees formed in these countries, we have a housewife, a social worker, a doctor and a lawyer coming together and trying to find out in a pre-trial community engagement how these problems and what are the solutions that are coming through the drug. So it's not about sitting and reading a form as is done in the developed countries to give their consent. The information can come verbally or visually. It does not have to come through bureaucratic paperwork and administrative work to show that yes, I know what is happening. This sort of informed consent has to be brought through more innovative methods, because we know that there are certain social problems in developing countries which act as a hindrance to the kind of informed consent that we visualize through contracts and legal methods.
I'd like to answer Sangeeta ma'am's question. Regarding genetic diversity, ma'am, there is a need for the entire world to be represented, because for endemic diseases like malaria, AIDS, tuberculosis, we need representation from developing countries, from countries where these diseases occur. Because unless these people unless they go in for these trials, it will be very difficult for the companies to actually find out how to go about it.
And ma'am, you said that majority of the trials have been shifted to China, but then those are medicines that are related to degenerative diseases like
I didn't say
arthritis.
that, they did.
They are related to they are related to diseases, degenerative diseases and arthritis and all these things. Plus also large number of trials are also happening in Africa, South America. India is one example where there has been a marked reduction. But if you talk about Africa, there has been a huge leap in the terms of the trials that are happening. Also, your point that there is an ethnic diversity in countries like US and England also. Ma'am, the ethnic diversity also has to be supported by climate and dietary requirements. These people living in India live in a different kind of climate, have a different sort of a dietary requirement that affects their physiology, which is not the same as Indian people living in US or Europe. And that diet and climate is going to influence the kind of effect that the drug has on your body.
Let's give the judges an opportunity to come back.
Do people get paid for taking part in these clinical trials?
Yes, but the payment is not given as an incentive to take part in the trial. It is given as an additional benefit to them.
Have you got any evidence that that communities, as you were suggesting very nicely, that communities might get involved in the whole consent process? Have you got any evidence that they can ever veto a trial they think is irrelevant to their community?
Yes, in the trials carried out in Nigeria for an anti-renal drug called tenofovir, there was a rights movement that was carried out in 7 of the African countries where Nigeria said that exploitation was happening and therefore tenofovir trials were cancelled in Nigeria.
Was that a good thing?
It just
Let's give Arushi an opportunity.
what it proves is that there is always a check in place. So anytime these trials turn to take advantage of the participants, if that's what we are asking, then there is always somebody who is looking after it, and if that is the case, then they are being asked to withdraw.
So just on the it seems to me that what you're saying about informed consent is that yes, it is very difficult to get people to understand it, and yes, there might be pressures that would mean they go along with things which might not necessarily be in their best interest. They may be, but you don't think that's very important. Is that right?
So the difficulty comes in...
So that's a legitimate. I mean, it's a legitimate point of view. Is that in the greater interest of the world's health, that some people may just need to be put at a bit of extra risk. Just some people. Is that fair?
Not. If you look at a utilitarian point of view, that's exactly what the utilitarian argument says, that there has to be collateral damage in the process.
So you think that's okay? You agree with that?
No, we won't agree to that because the exploitation that we're talking about is not actually happening at that level. And
I think Arushi wants to come back on something down.
Professor Diana, regarding the community involvement, in Africa they use the idea of a speaking book where the participants are told the details of the drugs verbally and visually. So that way everybody knows what is happening, and I think even the consent. So what I'm trying to say is that the participants are fully aware and they know everything. So they are not under any misconception.
Okay, I just wanted my question answered as well, which is what is the evidence you have that by participating in trials you somehow make the health service better?
One of you can answer this.
Yes, ma'am. I actually have 2 examples. The first one being Africa itself. Now, Africa has manufactured its own HIV vaccine, which is now being trialed in the US. So there's a domino effect that's happening. So when the trials were started in Africa, there was a certain level of training and expertise that is created that has actually enabled a country like Africa, which has 60% of the world's population suffering from AIDS, to carry out and begin.
That's benefiting the US, not necessarily the health system of the person in the village in Africa, isn't it? I would argue.
Ma'am, but how will it benefit the US if 60% of the AIDS population is living in Africa? So the drug is actually going to get trialed, approved by authorities, and come back to Africa because the patients are in Africa and not the US. And another example is Sri Lanka, where the most important economic segment, farmers, suffer from snake bites. And Africa has successfully been able to create an anti-venom and anti-allergic venom to solve the problem of snake bites.
Okay. I'm afraid, judges, just to be equitable with time, I'm going to have to leave you there. So thank you very much for your questions for both teams. We'll come back to you at the very end of the debate for your initial feedback and comments to both sides before you decide who you think has won this debate. So audience, this is your opportunity now. This is quite a big venue. I don't know where the microphones are, so I want people to, they're there, stand up and speak if you don't have a mic. So I'll get in as many of you as possible. It's good to see so many alumni in the audience in competition. So let's just start down here at the front. Can everyone keep their questions or points very succinct?
To the opposition, there's obviously a very clear power imbalance. It's completely clear that when multinational pharmaceutical companies are looking about where to go, they're not picking countries like, say, Norway, which has the highest wages in the world. They're going to some of the poorest countries. We've got the most desperate people with the least money. And it's quite obvious that that's because they can pay them less, they can get away with worse things, and it's nothing to do with factors about quality. And the reason they chose those countries is precisely because of that power imbalance and the fact that they can get away with paying them less. So how do you square the incredible power of a multinational corporation with desperate people in poverty who've got no alternative?
Could you Great question. Everyone needs to ask their questions, but keep it more succinct. So over here, one of you guys has your hands up. Just here in the second row.
Certain diseases like tuberculosis, malaria, dengue, as mentioned earlier, they are prevalent more in the developing countries. So if the trials are not conducted there, then how can pharmaceutical companies develop drugs for these diseases?
Okay, Angela, I'm going to get you to run up.
What was your name, sorry?
Sorry. No.
Could you say your name? My name is Tanya.
Okay. Don't
We've got someone at the back.
Yeah, so Angela, go up to Jake there with the blue and white stripe at the top, please. Again, pithy questions and points.
So Aaron and Georgia, isn't yours the ultimate post-imperial patriarchal viewpoint of trying to defend people who live in a country far away from you who you think can't stand up for themselves?
Okay, Jake, if you quickly pass it to Patrice, please.
Jumping on the anti-capitalist bandwagon again. If the pharmaceuticals are acting with the best intentions of the drugs and their patients and the people in the trials, why do they spend so much of their bulging profits on ridiculously large public relations budgets?
Thank you. Was there a young man with got a pop in the middle? Did you want to ask a question? No, you can change your mind, that's fine. So let's take the chap in the baseball cap there. Oh, there's a microphone ready there.
Thanks. To the opposition, you've not mentioned, or I think you should address, the corruption endemic in the third world, that what you pay for is not necessarily what you get is not what you pay for, and you can pay for something which wasn't what the trials produced. Corruption is rife. I think in India we've had the 2G, 3G phone scandals. I think the idea, you paint a rather rosy picture of consultation and informed consent. It doesn't sound anything like the reality of the third world that I'm aware of.
Okay, I'm going to take one more for these guys just to even it up. So he's got a question. Angela, if you can come down the front here. I will come out for more questions, I promise.
Hi, Alexandra. You talked about how there are a system of checks in place in developing countries, and you used the example of Nigeria. But isn't that a complete fallacy? Because, for example, in Nigeria, 3 years ago, GlaxoSmithKline were found to have bribed the Nigerian Justice Minister to stop an investigation into the trial of children with meningitis. So the thing with third world countries is that big pharmaceutical drug companies can just get around those checks quite easily.
Audience, thank you for the questions so far. There's quite a bit for the debaters to come back on, so I'm going to turn straight away to Georgia and Aaron. 3 questions before you.
I'd just like to respond to Tanya's point about whether trials for drugs that help people with TB, for example, should be conducted in developing countries. Yes, they should be. If these medicines are helping people with illnesses that are prevalent in developing countries, it would make no sense to conduct these trials in, say, the UK or the US, where such diseases are not the norm or not a part of problems in their country. That's not exploitation. Conducting trials for developing countries' treatment in developing countries is not exploiting people, it's helping them, and there's a complete difference. Aaron?
I'd like to come back to your point about isn't this just kind of the white man's burden almost? Well, no, it isn't, because this is actually a lot more than just us being worried about some people who don't actually care that much. This actually also affects you and affects your livelihood and affects the ability for you to get a good quality healthcare. So it isn't just about you caring kind of unnecessarily for someone, it's also about you caring for yourself.
Okay, final point, question? You happy with that? Oh, okay, that's fine. So, Payaswini and Arushi, if you can respond to the questions and points put to you. You need to be quite succinct and pithy in your replies. So over to you.
I'll deal with the question regarding corruption. Corruption is not only in the developing countries, it's everywhere. And you can't let a social issue like corruption come in the way of medical progress. And every time these trials take place, there are people being benefited. So the purpose of the trial is being served. Corruption can't come as an obstacle to scientific progress for the entire world.
Okay, Payaswini?
The argument made that give the people the worst drugs, pay them less, and take advantage of their desperation. And let me tell you, before a drug enters a country, there are certain government regulations that require the companies to tell whether the drug is good or bad. The regulatory authorities do not just comprise of government officials who may be accused of corruption. The regulatory authorities comprise of doctors and persons from NGOs who are going to work in the best favor of the society. Therefore, it's not the leftovers that are sent to the developing countries to be trialed, because even the countries that are outsourcing have their own interest to make the trial successful so that they can sell these medicines to the developed countries also. So I don't think the MNCs will anyway serve their purpose by selling the worst drugs to these countries and getting them trialed, because their purpose is to sell the drugs in the market. Therefore, they will ensure that the drug that's coming for the phase 3 trials in a larger sample does have certain qualities for itself to get approved by the government.
Okay. Anything else you want to comment?
There was another question regarding Nigeria and the fact that it's a fallacy that the minister was corrupt and he let the drug company. That's exactly what we're saying, that the misconduct was done by one individual, that minister. So his misconduct cannot come in the way of any developing country moving towards progress. So you cannot club the developing status of a country as being the fault for the process of the clinical trials not happening properly.
Okay, so Payaswini and Arushi, the pressure is going to be kept up on you because we're going to give Georgia and Aaron an opportunity to put a question or point to you. One question or point each. I'll give you guys an opportunity to respond and then a quick right to reply. So Georgia, what would you like to put to Our Lady Queen and missions based on what you've heard in Ireland?
Well, I was really interested in what you were saying about payment and how you said that payment is not given as part of an incentive to participate in these trials. I thought that payment was payment and money was money, and they were kind of quite similar. I don't understand why you would willingly participate in a clinical trial that could cause you some potential health risks if there was no benefit for you, often in the in financial terms.
Okay, Aaron, what would you like to put to them?
Back in 2006, Novartis, which is one of the big pharmaceutical companies, had a legal battle with the DCGI over exploitation and then exploiting India. Yet India let them carry on going purely. So you made this point about how if a community decides that exploitation is going, they can just say stop. Then why in this case has no one stopped anyone, even though everyone agrees that it's exploitation?
Okay, so there isn't time for both of you to answer both of those questions. You need to pick and choose who's going to reply to which.
I'd like to take Georgia's question. Money is money, but drugs are also drugs. So if somebody is going in for a trial, it is obvious that that person has been inflicted by the disease for which he qualifies to take part in the trial, and for that period he is getting medication which he would have otherwise not got. These drugs would not have been available to him otherwise. So I don't see how they get no benefit at all, because there have been cases where
Okay. Payaswini, do you want to pick up on the other question?
Yes. Can you please tell me whether after the legal battle between the GCI and the company, did the drug eventually reach the market?
It already had done.
And the drug did reach the market, and did it still continue in the market?
Well, not in the Indian one, because the company decided it didn't want to do it, present in India.
That proves exactly what I'm trying to say, that after the legal battle, the medicine was stopped from continuing in the market ahead, which shows that there may be hitches in the beginning, but the regulatory mechanism ultimately falls into place because the medicine was stopped from entering 1.2 billion people in the country because it was not effective. Therefore, because there may be cases of exploitation, but in the end, the larger picture, the larger medical benefit is taken care of. The wrong medicine is not administered in the market so that people can go and buy the wrong medicine.
Okay, so Georgia and Aaron, if you want a very quick right to reply on that, you can. But Payaswini and Arushi, whilst listening to them, you need to simultaneously be thinking about what questions and points you want to put to them. Okay? Anything you'd like to say?
I'd just like to respond to the idea that people who are participating in a clinical trial are affected by what the trial is testing for drugs to help them for. Not everybody who participates in a trial is affected by what the drug is trying to find a solution for. In fact, there are lots of examples of people who are not affected and who are simply participating in the trial for money, so they can continue to exist. And that is a clinical trial and the medication you get from it is no excuse for a poor healthcare system.
Okay. So you two, you have the opportunity to put these guys under pressure now. You've heard what they've argued. So a question or point from each of you.
Should we get back to them on what they said?
There isn't time for them to. You can get back to them, but based on what you've heard them argue, is there a particular thing you'd like to challenge them on? Something you think is important for your case?
Yes.
My question is, both of you spoke about lower costs leading to substandard drugs. But how is that possible? Because the lower cost is only because in developing countries like India and China, labor costs are lower. That is the only reason these costs go down. There is nothing. It's got nothing to do with the quality of the drug.
Okay. And Payaswini, question or point from you?
I would like you to tell me what is more important for you, the technical aspect of the nitty-gritties of a child that needs to be enforced upon the people, or the fact that even though there may some technical regulations may not be followed, but still the people are getting good quality healthcare in those countries. What is more important for you, the technical aspect or the overall holistic medical healthcare that the people end up getting after these trials?
Okay, that's clear cut. So Georgia and Aaron, pick one of those each responses.
I'd like to respond to the first one. About lower costs. Well, lower labour costs in a normal model is due to the fact that the labour being supplied is of a lower quality. So it's not necessarily just about it's lower standards across the board. It's not necessarily just because of lower labour, just that.
I'd like to respond to the idea that whether we're more concerned with the technical aspect or whether the medical care that people receive is more important. Research has proven that trialists often do not get adequate medical care, not only throughout their trial but also after the trial is finished. There was a report done by Wamos who did a lot of research in different countries that were sort of developing countries in terms of trials, and found that the majority of people were not actually being followed after the trial conduct had been concluded. A lot of the time, when questions were asked about the kind of medical care they would be getting throughout the trial, the people who were conducting the trials would refuse to give them answers.
Okay, so you guys have a right to reply on any of that if you'd like to come back.
Then how do you explain the fact that in small villages in India and Africa, where people prefer to go to a child clinic to get themselves cured rather than going to a public hospital, does that still say that people do not know, because the people obviously are seeing some kind of benefit that is coming to them from these trials because they are getting free medical care, and that care is going to be of a good quality because there is a research that is taking place in that care. How would you explain the fact that the preference is given more to clinical trials than to just go into public hospitals to get themselves cured?
Okay, you're going to have to let that stand as a rhetorical question, I'm afraid, because I want to go out for a second round of questions. It'll be an opportunity for you to come back on any of these points, I'm sure. Let's start at the back this time because I was a bit unfair. Where's the microphones? Quickly. Brilliant. So, Charlie, did you have a question at the back? Can you change your mind?
Change your mind.
Fine, okay. So right at the very back, I can't see who it is, I can just see a dismembered hand.
To the opposition, so given kind of the history of Western kind of investment in India, do you think, like in the Bhopal incident or sweatshops and various other free marketing kidneys, do you think the average Indian would approve of this or be concerned? Do you think the Abrahams of India would find this cause of concern or support it? And to the proposition, these are developing countries we're talking about, so I mean, let's say this is still investment, it might be exploitative, but it's still investment. Someone could argue that without this, these wouldn't be developing countries, that would just be static. I mean, you mentioned that people are so desperate that despite health concerns, they still go to these companies for these clinical trials. Does that not suggest they have no alternative, and does this not provide them with an alternative?
Okay, great questions. Teams, I'm just warning you, when I come back, you're not going to have time to answer all these questions. You need to think very carefully about which one question you most want to come back on. So, someone waving down here. Oh, is it Angela?
It's fine, I don't have to.
No, go.
Okay, so I was just interested by this whole cost issue. So, presumably, if we were to not conduct so many clinical trials in developing countries, then, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that there would be a greater number of phase 3 products which would not be trialled at all because they couldn't, for cost reasons, be trialled in a developed country. Now, wouldn't this be bad for innovation of drugs? Because if a drug doesn't go through phase 3, presumably it can't be released at all into phase 4. So then, presumably, we would have fewer newer products entering the market, and that's quite bad when you have loads of chronic disease.
Okay, so from one alumnus to another, except my colleague Ed Noel. So Angela, if you could run up here. Ed, if you could wave. Angela. Oh, sorry. Don't get to relax. So Ed Noel from Institute Brothers.
Thank you. This is a question to Graveney. There's been this cost, I think it seems like disingenuous, considering you're an economics student, that just because it costs less means that it's less for quality. It obviously costs less for the surplus of labour there. So for instance, to continue your suit analogy, a £140 suit from Marks and Spencer's is significantly less cost than a £140 suit that's handmade silk from Laos, right? So I think that it's not the case that just because something's cheaper is of a less quality.
Okay, any final points of questions? I won't be able to get you all in, I'm sure. So person there with the red thing on. Can you just wave so Angela? Yeah, you. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello, my point is that
You've got it. Do you want it? Yeah. Okay, fine. Okay, right at the back, so someone can run to the back. If you keep waving, hand at the back so they know who they're going to. Thank you.
I just like to ask the people for against exploitation and stuff.
Right.
Yeah. I just like to ask, do you have any evidence showing that although they are exploiting these people, is there anything that is harming them to a point where it's considered morally wrong? Whereas you can be exploiting someone, but if you're giving them something that at least is giving them a benefit, is it so wrong to be exploiting them in the first place?
Okay, thank you. Audience, I'm going to have to...
So what's his name?
That.
I'm going to have to bring it to an end, I'm afraid, just so we don't overrun. Now, teams, you're not going to have time necessarily to answer each of the questions. Starting with Erin, I'm going to give you an opportunity to answer one key thing each, something that's come up from last set of audience questions or something you just want to get across before we come to your final summation, okay? So Erin, one thing you really want to say, short 50 sentences.
Angela, you said, surely if it costs less, we can get more drugs. Well, Withers and Rogers are patent lawyer specialists, and they have discovered that over the period where there have been more trials done in India, there's actually been a fall in patents. For example, it's usual for a drugs company to patent anything up to maybe 300 drugs a year. Yet, in 2009, GlaxoSmithKline and Abbott, who are two of the largest drugs companies in the world, combined produced only 180 patents. And this actually is across the board. So we find that even though it is cheaper, we still get less research of a worse quality.
Erin, okay, so Georgia, one...
Yeah, just responding to the point about surely developing countries developing partly because of trials that are taking place in these countries, and that's aiding the sort of economic expansion. Developing countries and the growth in these countries is not dependent on clinical trials. They do not rely on the pharmaceutical industry to continue to grow.
Okay, so someone asked a very long question, so Payaswini's confused. But is there, I'm not sure we've got time to go back to the audience. Is there anything based on the discussion that's happened so far that this is your final opportunity before your final summation to come back on anything?
There may be a lot of questions about the amount of money that is given to these people and why it doesn't not function as an incentive. It's because this more important than the money is the healthcare that they're getting, because villages in India, what are they going to do with that money? They are farmers who grow crops and fall ill and do not have hospitals to go to get that kind of medicine. What are they going to do with the payment that these pharmaceutical companies give it to them? Money for us can be used in various ways, but money for these people is just a staggering piece of capital that cannot be utilized in any way. Whereas the free medicine that comes out of these trials is more important than any kind of monetary compensation given to them. Therefore, more than for the money, they go for the medical treatment that is given to them, because the parts in developing countries where these trials are happening have a complete absence of any form of medical care, and any scope of recovery that comes through these clinical trials or through the medicine given to them by the doctors taking part in the trial is a greater incentive than the amount of money that they may get by taking part in the trial, which is why we said that money over here does not function as an incentive.
Okay, so Payaswini's answered the key question that came up, and so Arushi's not going to repeat those points. What we are going to do now, though, is turn to the debaters' final 1 minute summation. This is an opportunity for them to again, try and convince the judges that their side of the motion is the right side of this debate. We're going to go in the same order in which we originally spoke. I'll tap on the table after 30 seconds, indicating you've got 30 seconds left. Georgia, over to you, your final thought.
Clinical trials in developing countries are exploitative. Pharmaceutical companies are able to make large profits outsourcing the trials, and are able to avoid the vital health and safety regulations that help ensure safe medication is produced. There is evidence that clinical trials are harming people in developing countries. Since 2006, WMS have been conducting research in a number of developing countries, and lots of their findings have found that people are significantly worse off as a result of the trials and have medical implications as a result. And what their research really showed was that the onus should not just be on the pharmaceutical companies to ensure their practices are ethical, but also on governments to tighten trial regulations and to invest more in their national healthcare and welfare systems.
George, thank you. Do a big round of applause at the end, just to save time. So, Payaswini, your final thoughts?
We support the process of conducting clinical trials in developing countries because we identify that there is a need to improve the standard of research in these developing countries. We cannot move ahead with the West-centric model where only the West carries out all the drug developments and enhancements in healthcare. We need to come back to the developing countries and enable them to empower themselves to carry out healthcare research, and this is happening as proven by various examples during the course of the debate that there is indigenous expertise that is being created through the process of clinical trials in the developing countries. Standard of research as a whole is going to improve, and there's going to be universal and holistic development of medical science, where people were getting no treatment at all in the absence of clinical trials in these developing countries. Now there is this hope for reduction in high rates of mortality and morbidity, and there is a chance that people see a hope of recovery and increase in life expectancy through access to drugs that come via clinical trials to developing countries. Therefore, I would urge you to support the cause of clinical trials in developing countries.
Payaswini, thank you very much. Erin, your final thoughts, please.
To finish, I'd like to draw your attention to an example of where a Swedish company went to Mumbai and tested a drug which had already been proved to give rat bladder cancer to 36 Indian women who subsequently had to have their ovaries removed and then were left stranded by this company. See, does clinical trials in the developing world help them? No. Does it help us? No. Do we get more medicines? No. See, it exploits us and it exploits them. So in short, we all lose. Therefore, I implore you to support the motion.
Thank you, Erin, and finally, Arushi.
I'd like to say that rejecting these trials due to allegations of them being exploitative will only result in denial of better healthcare to millions of people in developing countries. Irrespective of where they are conducted, most trials have adhered a stringent set rule of deviation from which would lead to suspension of the trial, as discrepancy in one phase leads to the cancellation in the other. In any medical progress, there will be predictable and unpredictable outcomes. That is exactly why they are called trials. But just because they might be there, it doesn't mean that you have to abandon the entire system, because that is the only way the world can progress scientifically and medically.
Arushi, thank you very much. Big round of applause. Well done, teams. You can relax, but a key part of the process, as you know, is to now pay attention to what the judges are about to say to you. Their feedback is constructive criticism, and it's about making you better debaters and thinkers in the future. So judges, we're going to ask you first of all, please, for feedback initially for Georgia and Erin from Graveney School arguing for the motion. I'm going to ask you to keep it relatively succinct. You can give further feedback when you come back. Rob, could we start with you, please?
I wasn't persuaded by your arguments for the motives of the pharmaceutical companies, and I think that this is the biggest problem I have with what you're arguing. I can understand the mechanics of what happens, but there's a sort of implicit conspiracy theory in what you're saying, is that there's somewhere at the heart of this, the pharma companies are trying to get away with something, and yet they are the most exposed and transparent businesses, if you like, on the market, because we consume their products. If anything's wrong with them, then it's immediately obvious, pretty much. And they're going to get into trouble, they're going to lose their reputation, which these days is hugely important. And I was trying to follow what it was you were saying that they were trying to do, but none of it really made sense. And wasn't really particularly, I do agree on the point you made about your understanding of economics, by the way. I think you'll find that cheaper labour is not necessarily the same as inferior labour. And a lower cost can sometimes just be a lower cost without any implication of inferiority. So ultimately I wasn't persuaded.
Okay, thank you, Rob. And Diana?
Yes, well, you might expect me not to be totally persuaded either. I think that the notion that clinical trials in developing countries are exploitative, one of the things that you kind of fell down a bit was that you said we're not against clinical trials, but we're against exploitative ones. And that isn't quite the same as the motion, which is that they are exploitative. Having said that, I mean, I think that looked at the literature well, you quoted things where things had gone wrong well, you brought that up spontaneously in your arguments, and all of those are true. What you failed to do, I think, was to persuade me that that was the norm rather than the exception. And I think the other thing that the argument that actually we all lose in the north as well, because then you do less trials, I couldn't quite follow all of that. But I have to say that you had a really good go at it. And you also responded very fast to all the things that were thrown at you, including us. Sorry.
Diana, thank you. And finally, Sangeeta.
Well, I'd agree with Diana that you were very quick on the uptake and you answered all questions to the best of your ability. But it's also, what I felt was that there's a kind of a throwback to maybe a few decades ago, when you had a particular vision of developing countries and how the governments function and how the people respond to various things, that the situation has changed a lot now. And probably, if you think of the way things are now, most of your arguments sort of did not really hold water for me. So I would say that you could have probably come at it from a different point of view, from a different angle, to make it more to make it more persuasive to people who are listening. Overall, I thought that the intention was very good, and you responded very well to questions. But there were these certain kind of weaknesses, probably an unfamiliarity with the way things have evolved.
Sangeeta, thank you very much. So you guys can genuinely relax now. But you can hear what I'm going to say about the other team. Judges in the same order, please, for Payaswini and Arushi. Rob.
The problem you had is that it's unlikely that, there is an imbalance of power between the developed and the developing world, almost by definition. And rich and powerful, not very rich and powerful. So it's unlikely that there isn't some form of imbalance there. And it's unlikely that that imbalance is going to be overcome by better slideshows or anything like that. So I think you're struggling to try to. I know you kind of understand that, and it's quite a tricky thing. And actually, you explained that, I think, quite well from the point of view of people in the developing world, that they make a decision, a trade-off, basically, between the risks they're taking and the possible rewards, both from the likelihood of a cure and also money. I'm sure money is important. I don't think you could deny that. In poor countries, money is more important. So I think you did quite well on that. Just one thing on Payaswini. I really loved your passion, but it doesn't help you to try to get twice as many words into every sentence, into every minute as anyone else. So you just need to slow down a bit, because some of your arguments just got a bit lost in the exposition.
Rob, thank you very much. It also makes it very difficult for me to chair because I can't get a word in edgeways. Diana, over to you, please.
Well, I enjoyed your passion, actually, and of course I guess that I have the advantage of knowing a bit more about the subject, so I was quite pleased that you managed to try and squeeze so much in. But I think that you put arguments pretty well. For example, the consent issues and different ways of doing consent other than the formal northern way. I was pleased to hear about that. I think one thing you did miss out on was my question, which was, what's the evidence that participating in clinical trials results in a better health system or better health for people? And what you came back to with was the products, the output of the products of the trials, rather than the participation in general in clinical trials. And I think that's the second one is a more difficult question to answer, because there are examples where, where actually people, countries may be very good at doing primary research, but their implementation is atrocious, So those kind of arguments, I didn't think you grasped that quite so well. But all in all, I think you argued very well.
Diana, thank you. Finally, again, Sangeeta.
I would also agree with Diana and with you that you argued very well, and most of your points were very well made. Probably you got sort of caught up on a few issues that were thrown at you, to which you could not, come back with a very, very conclusive kind of a response to. But there were few and far between, and overall, I thought your presentation was good. The arguments that you made were good. The way you explained the corruption issue, and you said it's not, really related. To some extent, I agree with that. But the fact remains that in most developing countries, that is a concern, and it does impact a lot of things, including the way, even a non-governmental organization or, a doctor or whatever can be, there have been instances of people being purchased, and, so there are certain things that you probably, try to whitewash a little bit, but overall I thought it was good.
Sangeeta, thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause for this panel? Our judges to leave the stage and head up to the top. My colleague Jason will escort you outside. I need you to come to an informed, considered, but relatively swift decision. Not to put any pressure on. Audience, if you can stay put, we're going to do an audience vote just for fun. It has no consequence to the result. The students tell me they don't find it fun at all, but we insist on it. Okay, so audience, you're quite a sizable audience, only two small groups of people here who have a vested interest in either of these teams. Can I see a show of hands? As soon as Sangeeta's. Can I see a show of hands for those who honestly felt, on balance, based on the arguments put here today, that Georgia and Erin from Graveney School arguing for this motion won that debate? Can I see a show of hands, again, your honest opinion, for those who thought Payaswini and Arushi from Our Lady Queen of Mission School arguing against the motion won that debate? Now that has no consequence whatsoever, and I don't need the team to worry about it. Stay put, the judges will be back in just a moment, and we'll find out which of these two teams is the Debating Matters International Champion. So, without further ado, these two teams wait quite a long time for this debate. Judges, who's going to explain? Brilliant. So, Diana, first of all, how you've come to your decision and finally which of these two teams has won.
Okay, we came to our decision by really discussing the pros and cons of the two teams. First of all, we'd like to all congratulate both teams on a fantastic debate. And we think, I think we've already given some comments back to you all, but I think a couple of, just a quick individual things. Georgia, you went for the jugular on the economics and picked up on that, which your opposition hadn't really completely gone for, so well done for that. Aaron, you were a little bit rhetorical, and quality and cost and how they go together, I think you need to think about that a little bit more. The Indian team, we liked the subtlety of the way you looked at things and the way you answered back, to not be distracted from the question where people talked about things like exploitation. Your answers about informed consent we thought were very good. Where they talked about corruption, you said, well, that shouldn't mean you throw the baby out of the bathwater. We like that. So overall, we had a unanimous decision that the Indian team are the winners.